Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for bearing with us as we took a moment to get started. My name is Tanuja Gupta, and I am thrilled to be your moderator today. I founded the Caste Equity Legal Task Force last year, and the task force is a nationwide coalition of litigators, law professors, legal advocates, and law school students that are all committed to ending caste-based discrimination. If you've never heard the term caste or the word Dalit, don't worry. That's exactly why you're here today, and that's the whole purpose of this particular seminar. So I know we got started a little bit late. People are just coming in. I I think today, we'll focus on getting everyone comfortable with what the terms are and the legal arguments. I came to this fight in a pretty personal capacity after experience at Google, which we'll share if we have some time. But the members of our task force came together for a very specific task, which was to push forward the historic California Senate Bill 403 through the legislature in 2023. So today we'll talk about that bill along with a host of other matters with our esteemed panelists, and then we'll try to save some time for Q&A depending on how we're going. Now, you may have gotten an email earlier that we are still pending the CLE credit approval, but we've distributed materials as per the regular protocol. I'll share the codes throughout the panels, and then we will make sure to follow up with everyone for issuing certificates. So with that, let me briefly introduce our wonderful panelists. First, we have David Tracy. He is the managing partner at Sanford, Heisler & Sharp, where he focuses on civil rights and workers' rights. Last year, he fielded questions from the legislature, which led to both the Senate and the House passing SB 403 in California. Next, we have Patrick Patterson, a civil rights attorney in California and former senior counsel to the chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, along with counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Next, we have Sapna Panya. She is a feminist Hindu priest and scholar. She is the founder of Chingari Consulting. She's an officiant or panditya. We'll talk about that today, and she conducts progressive and feminist Hindu ceremonies and weddings. She also holds a BA degree in religion, and she focuses on Vedantic Hinduism and Islam and biology, as well as has a master's in public health. Last but certainly not least, we'll probably have one more speaker joining if he's able to attend. Prem Pariyar, he's a social worker and chair of policy and equity at Human Relations Commission in Alameda County. Prem immigrated from the US to Nepal, and as a Dalit, he actually faced caste discrimination in both countries. So he'll share his experiences and his accomplishments in advocating for protections today. And the off chance that he can't join, his article is actually one of the written materials that were sent to you, and I highly encourage you to read through it as well. The detailed biographies of everyone are on our website, and you can read through all their amazing accomplishments and their publications, which I encourage you to check out. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for joining us today and doing this. So let's go ahead and kind of jump in here. I think before we get into the legal conversations, I want to set the context, Sapna, starting with you. As a scholar on this topic, what is caste for someone who's never heard of it? Or rather, what is a caste system?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tanuja. Thank you for the panel today. As you said, one of my roles, one of my hats is as a pandita. Pand basically means knowledge, and a pandita, in the way that I interpret that word, is someone who collects knowledge. And so I consider myself a knowledge collector and a scholar on on Hinduism. And in my study, I think the word caste, I have come to understand it. Hierarchy is probably the easiest way to talk about it. We have hierarchy in all different societies, of course. And obviously, if you are at the top of that hierarchy, you have certain privileges, you have greater access to that privilege. For example, to capital, to education, to different kinds of opportunities, jobs, etc., marriage prospects. All of that is connected to so the social stratification that comes with caste. And obviously, if you sit at the bottom, then you need protection from those, from being able to access those things equitably, capital, education, all the different opportunities. And obviously that access gets threatened and gets denied often in different societies. And so really that's the simplest way to explain what caste is that it's a social stratification. And of course, again, in different cultures and different societies, that stratification is based on different characteristics. With the South Asian caste system, and I'll talk about it as something belonging to the subcontinent overall, because of course it predates the partition of the subcontinent. It does span the various countries that make up South Asia. So for those that are not familiar, I'm talking about India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Myanmar or Burma. All the people that live in those countries, the 1.9, almost 2 billion people in the subcontinent, as well as, of course, the 5 million or so in the diaspora that live in the US, in the UK, in the Caribbean, in parts of Africa, et cetera, that have immigrated and brought that social hierarchy and social stratification with them. As we've immigrated, we've brought some of that stratification with us, and unfortunately, the related discrimination with that. So the system, the caste system, basically organizes people with regards to their ancestry, their clan, let's say, their community, and also their occupation. And so the easiest way that people have talked about the caste system, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I'll just go with it for now, is that the priests are at the top, which is the caste referred to generally as the Brahmin caste. The warriors are next, which is the word that's typically seen is the word Kshatriya. Then the merchants or the Vaishyas, and then the Dalits, the peasants, the Shudras, and the servant class, and then the Dalits who are actually outside of that hierarchy. So you see a pyramid, you see those four strata, those four social strata, and that Dalits, also known as untouchables, also known as Adivasis, indigenous people as well, are all outside of actually that social hierarchy, which spans back. So based on your placement in the hierarchy, you are born into a particular caste or social strata. And that is actually something that's recognizable even by somebody's name. So somebody can see my name, for example, see the Pandya, somebody from the subcontinent, let's say, can see my name, and immediately my name tells you my social strata. Pandya is Brahmin and comes from the Brahmin upper caste. And that is, along with that, I get privileges, right? Like whether or not I earn them, like they're just afforded to me just by the fact that I have this last name. And similarly, on the other end, somebody who's born Dalit, comes along with the name, comes along with one's birth, and these are, immutable and also non-fungible. You cannot change your caste. There are people who, might change their name to remove that caste marker. However, there's other ways of finding out what one's caste is. And so no matter what level of wealth you achieve or acquire, or education you acquire or achieve, depending on that placement, those other privileges that I talked about earlier, jobs, capital, opportunities, marriage, as I mentioned earlier as well, all of those things, you're relegated to those specific opportunities based on that class or caste you were born into. And I know I'm using the words interchangeably, but that's because of the way it ends up being played out often in society as well. So yeah, I hope that I haven't confused more. I hope that I've given some context as to what the caste system kind of is, both in the subcontinent as well as pertaining to the diaspora.
No, that's a great setup for what caste system is actually and what we're trying to tackle. But can you talk about where this originated? How did this come to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, all societies have different types of social strata, right? For the subcontinent in particular, and for this specific word caste, it is the word itself, caste, is doesn't come from a South Asian language per se, but the concept of caste comes very much from Vedic scripture. And so Hindu, in other words, ancient Hindu scripture, which is known as Vedic scripture, does refer to different social strata. Not the discrimination. So I want to distinguish those two, but the actual stratification of society, that itself is something that is found in scripture. So there's this famous verse that is talked about a lot from the Rig Veda, which is the oldest recorded text, that when human was created, or Purusha was created, that of his mouth came the Brahmin, the upper caste, of his shoulders came the Kshatriya, or the word that's used in the Vedas is the Ranja, which are the warriors. Of the thighs came the Vaishyas, or the merchants, and of the feet came the Shudra, or the servant class. And these are referred to as Varna. Actually, the word that's used in the scriptures is Varna, because that means classes or stratifications, basically. It literally means color. It is the different ways of stratifying society. That is what gave way, though, to the genesis of the caste system, right? So it was much later in Hindu text, the Manusmriti, technically, which is, again, a text written by a person named Manu. So, religious scholars such as myself would argue that it doesn't hold the same kind of religious authority or scriptural authority. However, Manusmriti is something that holds a lot of importance in Hindu society, right? Whether or not it holds theological importance, it holds a lot of importance in Hindu society, and that the Manusmriti, it governs a lot of how society acts and behaves. And that in that book you will find, or in that text you will find, that certain body parts, the mouth and the shoulders in particular, as I mentioned, the Brahmin and the Kshatriya caste, are considered pure, and those that come from below the navel are considered impure. And so that's where the origin of the discrimination then starts. If you're talking about purity and impurity, then you're beginning to talk about how some people are pure versus impure, right? And so the Varnas, again, the Vedas, that refer to the Varnas are not referred to as one is pure and one is impure, just simply that these are 4 different ways of stratifying society. However, the Manusmriti, which came later, and as I mentioned, is referred to and used a lot to frame how Hindu society functions, that is where the discrimination comes from. And it's also the way that it's practiced, again, like I said, in South Asian society, is that it is immutable. It cannot be changed. And that's not found in the Vedas. The Vedas don't talk about it in that way. The classification in the Vedas is actually based on one's character. However, the way it's practiced in Hindu society, and has been for now thousands of years, is one's birth as opposed to one's character. I personally believe that there are Hindus like myself who don't believe in practicing this discrimination. But because the discrimination does exist and it is being practiced, I do think it's important for me, especially as a Hindu upper caste person, to speak out against it and to say that, we need legislation, advocacy around that, so that the lower castes can be protected. Because again, when I mentioned about how society is stratified in different ways, it's always those that are marginalized, that are at the bottom, strata of society, that require protection. And particularly because caste is immutable in the way that it is practiced and the way that it's written about in Manusmriti, it is something that one cannot change, just like one's race. And so if we're going to, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get into, exactly the origins of anti, race discrimination legislation, but I believe it can be considered akin because it is also something that is immutable. And I'm governed more by Hindu texts that talk about how, it's a sin to commit injustice, but it's actually a greater sin to tolerate that injustice. And that's what governs the way that I practice my Hinduism. But unfortunately, in Hindu society and in other South Asian societies as well, the caste system is still very much practiced. And it comes from the origins being Hinduism. So, obviously, India is also home to the largest Muslim population. Muslims in India also, there is a caste stratification. There's a stratification in Christian communities, in Sikh communities as well. But that only exists in the subcontinent, right? Arab Muslims or other parts of the world where Muslims live, they don't have the caste stratification. So it is definitely part of the syncretism of the subcontinent, that it came from, it originated from the Hindu history of the subcontinent.
That's a perfect segue actually into the question that I have next for Prem. So that's very helpful to understand the scope of it. But Prem, you I understand, you originated from Nepal, right? And in India and Nepal, caste discrimination is officially banned, but it still persists. Just as in America, racial discrimination is, of course, unlawful, but I don't think anyone would dispute that it still persists. You left Nepal because of the caste discrimination you were facing and came to America on asylum, right? And so I was struck when we first met, having read your article in the LA Times, that you faced caste discrimination in the Bay Area. And you had several instances of it. Can you walk through a little bit of, what you experienced and witnessed and how it manifested here in America?
Thank you so much, Tanuja, for this wonderful opportunity to share my personal experience at this forum. At first, I want to thank Sapna for, being authentic, talking about the reality, sharing the truth, coming from privileged background. So you are I really appreciate, because many people, they don't accept the truth. The truth is that caste discrimination exists globally, not only in South Asia, not only in Nepal, not only India. So, as you asked to share my experience related to caste, discrimination. So, I do remember, like, when I was 7 years or 8 years old that time. I was in elementary level. I was child that time. Uh, my teacher, she asked me to bring a mug of water uh, in to the class. She was like in the office, and she came out and she asked me, "Can you bring a mug of water?" So I was very excited. I was so happy, I was able to help my teacher, right? So water was there. I brought water for her. She took a sip. When fellow students outed me as an untouchable, my teacher immediately spit out the water. She dropped the jug of water, on the ground, and yelled at me for not telling her my caste earlier. I felt really embarrassed and scared, like then after that. And I had to face, the consequences. My teacher, I had to face, multiple times punishment, physical punishment. So that when I was inside, that trauma still exists in my mind. I never forget that moment. And so I was in, my childhood, my, the whole life. Uh, I lived in segregated, blaze, Dalit blaze. That's another reality, like African Americans. So I also had, our village was also segregated. And my family, uh, the recent, in around 2013, my family was physically assaulted, brutally assaulted in the capital of Nepal, in the capital city of Nepal. And it was very hard for me to 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 get justice. Justice was denied, and there was a lot of pressure, political pressure from the dominant caste. So I was the target. Finally, to flee caste apartheid, I came here in United States. So you in my background, you already mentioned that. So I did not expect, in Bay Area, I would be discriminated, because in diaspora, my understanding was our identity will be only Nepali diaspora. So I will not be recognized with my, like caste, or like, that doesn't matter, because people are highly educated here. People, they have like their one job, like, right, happy living lifestyle. I used to think that, and many, like, many immigrant, they think that. So I was very, like, I was very devastated when I faced, like, for the first time, like, in my, within my own community, like I was invited in a house party. And so that time, like, when I never I never hide my caste identity. That's, like, one problem for me. So being a activist, so how can I hide my identity? So I told, when I told them I'm Prem Pariyar, their facial expression was immediately changed. And so at the time of lunch, like, food was prepared on the table, but, like, I was asked not to touch that food. They will prepare plate for me. So yeah, you can go and sit in sofa, so we'll bring food for you. Can you imagine that moment? I was, like, totally, like, I was very frustrated, and, like, that moment was very sad moment for me. So, and I could not say anything, because, like, I was undocumented. I was, like, struggling that time. And I just, like, I just quiet. I did not say anything. Next moment, like, when I was working in restaurant, that time, like, usually in restaurant, the restaurant owner, they do provide shared housing for their, like, workers. I was with my, like, I was this is the this is it happened, like, I know, like, it happened in Bay Area, in Dixon, near Sacramento, near capital city of California. So my co-worker, who is from dominant caste from Nepal, he said, he told me, so please, you can't come with us. You can't come with us until, like, I stay here. You need to live in van. You cannot, like, I'm not ready to share that housing with you. He did not tell me, like, you are untouchable, but, like, he told me I cannot share that shared room with me. I had no answers. I know the reason. And I used to live in that van almost a month. So during that time, like, the whole month, I had to hear, like, he used to talk about, like, reservation based on caste in Nepal. You guys are, like very unworthy. So why do you need, like, this reservation? You need to have merit like us. You know, it was very difficult for me to spend even a single day there in such environment. I left that job. I left that job and I started, like, working in another restaurant owned by Nepali owner. So there, like, my coworker who was in like government job in Nepal. He was police officer in Nepal. He was my coworker here in a restaurant. He was safe, and I was like kitchen helper that time. And, like, it's very traumatic to remember all this moment.
No,
But, like, he ordered me, like, to chop up a large, sack of onions in, like, within, like, short period of time. I was just like starting to work in a restaurant because that was not my career. That was not like, long time. I did not work as a restaurant worker. He asked me, you have to, this is not Nepal. This is not Nepal. In Nepal, you have reservation. But here, you need to work hard like us. It was very like, embarrassing. And like, he used to say like, slurs, caste slurs, sometimes F words. I had nothing to say, like, it is like, it was very like, painful moment for me. After that, I stopped working in restaurant. I started like, I started to volunteer in different non-profit organizations in different capacities. So that time, what happened, some of my community leaders, their behavior was very different because I belong to caste oppressed community because of my surname. One of my community leaders, he like, I remember, I know him, I remember that moment. So he told me, he came closer to me and he told me, Prem, you know this guy, though he is using dominant caste surname, but he belongs to your caste. He is a community leader, Nepali community leader. He told me that he belongs to your caste. So with these examples, we can imagine caste matters every day. This is like very important in day-to-day conversations in South Asian diaspora, in South Asian, like, community.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful that you're basically re-traumatizing yourself to educate others, and can't thank you enough for being willing to share this. I think one question that comes up in many conversations, and you've alluded to it a little bit, is like, well, how do people know your caste? What are the clues? Almost like the detective in them kicks in. Now, you've mentioned a couple of things. Name, um, your you just kind of declaring yourself, your own caste identity, and your activism work as well. Um, the reservation, we'll talk a little bit about the reservation system when we get to the Cisco case as well, but kind of a high level for folks. We don't have quotas and like the affirmative action system that the way we have in other countries, where certain seats are held in universities and in jobs, saying X% of jobs must go to people from certain castes to actually level the playing field. But that kind of stuff is known in other countries. And so that's a little bit about what Prem is mentioning. I think, Prem, there's one last question that I have for you. You've talked a little bit about how second generation South Asians who, really may not know their background and kind of their caste identities. And I remember you mentioning the TV show Indian Matchmaking. And can you just talk a little bit about that for some of folks on the call who might be wondering, like, how do you think about that if someone doesn't even know kind of what their caste background is? What do you say to them?
Yes, this is very interesting question. Thank you, Tanuja. Definitely, like, even if like you don't reveal caste background, so certain surnames or professions are associated with particular caste, as are geographic areas. So I mentioned that before, like, so we had very like segregated, like, blaze or like, uh, and next thing is, so I mentioned like my last name, surname. This is like, another marker for like, for caste identity. And so some of like, some of our community members, they use dominant caste surname, or they hide their caste identity just to protect them from like, possible violence or neglect. right? So I saw like many community members in Bay Area, in California, and also dietary habits sometimes are used against you, like not being a vegetarian. So for my case, what happens? I'm a vegetarian. I'm a vegetarian from my childhood. So being vegetarian is also a problem for me. So what happens when I go to like, house party, when I go to like, a community gathering. So when I like, when I say like, I don't have to say vegetarian. So people like, they look at my plate and they say, oh, you don't have meat? You are vegetarian? Yes, I'm vegetarian. When did you start to become vegetarian? From my childhood. Oh, like, Dalits are also like pretending to become a Brahmin. This is unusual. Like, I have to hear this time and again. And I don't know how long I have to listen. When I say vegetarian, people, I don't know, like, they look at me, look at my plate and like, they start to say, this is like, another reality. And like, from your time working in tech, which has many caste privileged South Asians, sometimes they ask about your Z rank, which is a competitive exam in India that breaks rank by different caste, right? So, all about merit. So, or literally, like they will toss your back to feel for the Hindu thread that Brahmins wear. So many, like, in Nepal, like we say Zanai, I think Zanai in India also. And this is like, this is very common in diaspora. Like, so I witnessed some of my community members who are from caste oppressed community background. They like, they they wear that Hindu thread, that Zanai, just to protect themselves. I saw that.
Yeah.
And I will say that I also think there are second generation South Asians who, even though, like, they may not know their background like mine or these kinds of details. They do know what caste is being described to them. Just like, as you said, like in TV show, like, India matchmaking, that arranged marriage based on caste. And if you say like, different matrimonial sites, so caste is like, precisely mentioned there, looking for Brahmin bride or bridegroom, So these are pretty common. These are realities. This is the realities. And we need to accept that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Prim. I think that's very helpful for people that may not be kind of clued into it, whether it's your name, where you came from. Sometimes not knowing your caste background is the sign of caste privilege because you've never had to worry about it, right? I just want to connect dots because a question came in with the idea of food being an indicator. So Frame mentioned professions were sometimes associated with caste. And so in the past, Dalit people have been relegated to some of the most awful jobs, cleaning latrines, taking care of carcasses of animals, right? And so they did not necessarily have the luxury of being a vegetarian. They were eating animals, right? And so that became another sign. So these are the types of things, the rank that Prem mentioned. Imagine in America if your SAT score was different if you were a man versus a woman, right? And so when someone asks what you got in your SAT score, they're really fishing for something else. And so these are the kinds of things that come together. But something I want to come back to you because Prem is a practicing Hindu, right? And so I think one of the things we've experienced is in part of pushing for SB 403 is that people tend to think that speaking out or some people tend to think that speaking out against caste discrimination is somehow anti-Hindu or it stereotypes Hindus. Can you reconcile these schools of thought for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Prem, again for sharing your personal lived experience. As you said, it is re-traumatizing, for you to say it. So I do appreciate you sharing those memories, and I'm sorry that you've, experienced all of that. You continue to experience all of that. And I just one small thing first also about the second gen thing, because that is how I identify. I was born in the United States. I identify as second generation South Asian myself. And as you rightly pointed out, Tanuja, part of the reason why I think folks like me who are upper caste, second gen, don't think about caste is because we don't have to, because I didn't have to worry about it because I came from upper caste, second gen background. So it's, the expectation was always that I can and should achieve everything I set myself to try to achieve, right? So that was always the expectation for me. And I will also say from the upper caste perspective, I heard and was witness to lots of caste discrimination myself, as in people of my upper caste saying anti-lower caste or anti-Dalit things. And so I also know it exists because I was in the rooms where those things were being said, right? And that's what shapes the thought of perhaps a lot of other second gens who may not understand fully all of it, but they're like, in this diaspora where there is a pressure to kind of like hold on to one's identity and one's culture and da 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 da, a lot of this stuff gets swept into, me practicing my identity ends up being me continuing to uphold vegetarian practices in a way that is, it's fine to be vegetarian, but in a way that is looking down on people who are not vegetarian, right? Because you're somehow feeling like I'm proud of my heritage or something by doing that. And I think that's where it gets a little bit confusing, especially for folks in the diaspora. So greater knowledge is necessary. And what you were talking about with, the fact that people were talking about caste discrimination, speaking out against caste discrimination as being anti-Hindu, that was so confusing for me to kind of wrap my head around. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that my Hinduism, what I was taught as a Hindu from my elders and parents and dance gurus and everybody, was that it was not to discriminate. My understanding was actually that we are all one. There's a saying in Hinduism, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, we are all one, the world is one family. Like that's what I was taught, right? I was taught that is how you be a good Hindu, is you treat others with respect, no matter who they are, that you treat them with respect because you see the divine in them. So what's confusing to me is that if there's a bill protecting against caste discrimination, if you're saying that that's anti-Hindu, then are you suggesting that it's pro-Hindu to allow caste discrimination? I mean, that's the logical flip of that argument, right? Is that, well, then that means that to be casteist is to be Hindu, right? If you're saying that protecting caste discrimination is anti-Hindu somehow. So it's a confusing argument to me that folks are making. And I appreciate that, again, this comes from the pressure of being in the diaspora and feeling like, your community is being somehow, what do you call it, painted with a negative brush or something like that. But it's much more useful for those of us with privilege to actually accept and acknowledge that the discrimination occurs and then stop it, right? As opposed to just saying, oh, we don't do that. Yes, we do. We do it, and we can stop doing it. And if more Hindus were to say, actually, to be Hindu is to not discriminate on the basis of caste, and we shouldn't continue this practice, I think that would be a much more powerful argument to prove how you are, quote unquote, so Hindu, right? Is to actually say that we should actually be practicing those tenets of equality and of love and of respect of a fellow human being. So yeah, that I just, yeah, thank you for the question, because I do want to share that there are others like me that do believe that to be Hindu actually means to not discriminate on the basis of caste, and that is why we need to protect that.
I love it, Sapna. I think you've missed your legal calling here as you're talking about arguments and reverse logic. So we have now entered the second half of today's panel to talk a little bit about what the legal arguments are. So I mentioned at the beginning of this panel that this task force came together to really bring momentum to SB 403. So for those who aren't familiar, SB 403 was a bill that clarified existing California civil rights laws, and it explicitly included protection against discrimination based on someone's perceived position in a caste, regardless of whether that was the South Asian caste system or any other caste system. So, for example, in California, there's a sizable Oaxacan population that is very familiar with the Mexican caste system, right? Which is why Fresno actually was the first city in California that passed a bill that banned caste discrimination. But you can also look at other countries like Japan, where the system stems from like labor in the ancient feudal system. And so it's called the Burakumin. I still mispronounce it. I apologize. But there was the untouchable class, the Eta, right? And they were considered a seventh of an ordinary person, right? Or in Nigeria, where caste is really kind of based on enslavement and the spirituality of your lineage, the Osu and Ohu still face a lot of difficulty in kind of upward mobility based on intermarriage, right? So Senator Wahab, who was the person who authored the bill, grew up in Fremont, and she was seeing a lot of this because it's a pretty diverse community, right? And so she authored the bill. So Patrick, I'm going to come to you first, because on top of what Senator Wahab was seeing personally, there was also a case that everyone had their eyes on. It was a big impetus for the bill, and it's the Cisco case. You've been following this case pretty closely since it was filed. I think the suit was filed in 2020. For someone who isn't familiar, could you set the stage? Like, what were the allegations? How did they fit into the scheme of California's overall anti-discrimination laws?
I try to do that quickly. I know we're getting short on time. But I think we do have to set a baseline first and talk a little bit about federal anti-discrimination laws like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, and religion. Those are the categories. And that law and other federal laws generally have not been interpreted to cover discrimination based on caste. So that's why SB 403 became an important potential tool in challenging caste discrimination. There are no state or federal laws that I know of in the US that explicitly list caste as a protected category. There are, as Tanuja mentioned, there are a few cities who have begun to do this, and some university systems have done it, but no state or federal laws that explicitly prohibit caste discrimination. Some laws, including California's state civil rights law, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, do prohibit discrimination based on ancestry. And that is a category that may lend itself more to the argument that there's some kind of caste discrimination that's prohibited. So SB 403 would have added caste to the categories under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And as Tanuja mentioned, it was passed overwhelmingly in the California Senate and Assembly. But in October of 23, Governor Newsom did not sign it. He declined to sign it into law. He said that the state's civil rights protections are to be liberally construed. And he said, quote, "Because discrimination based on caste is already prohibited under these existing categories, this bill is unnecessary." So that was the justification for not signing it into law. So the word caste still does not appear in the California law, but the governor at least thinks it's covered anyway, even though the legislature thought a statutory amendment was necessary. So that brings us to the Cisco case that Tanuja mentioned, which was filed before SB 403 was ever introduced. I'm not currently involved in the case. My remarks are based primarily on what's available in the public record and court documents and in the press. But it was filed in 2020 by the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, which later changed its name to the California Civil Rights Department, or CRD. It was filed in state court alleging that Cisco and two upper caste managers of Indian descent had discriminated against a Dalit engineer, also of Indian descent, because of his caste. And of course, because caste is not a category listed, it alleged discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, and ancestry, and alleged discrimination, harassment, and retaliation on the job in violation of the Fair Employment and Housing Act. The two upper caste managers were later dismissed from the case, and we'll talk about that in a bit if we have time. The allegations of the complaint are that Cisco, of course, is a major tech company. It has more than 18,000 employees in California, 83,000 worldwide. It provides IT services and products. It was founded more than 40 years ago. It's a Fortune 100 company with $51 billion in annual revenue. So it's a big player. The great majority of Indian immigrants to the US, according to the CRD's complaint, they said more than 90% are upper caste. And that the same is true of Cisco's workforce. And the complaint also alleged that Cisco has employed a predominantly South Asian Indian workforce for decades. An administrative complaint was filed by an employee who worked for Cisco in a team composed entirely of Indian employees who grew up in India and immigrated as adults to the US. Other than this employee, the entire team he worked on were upper caste Indians. And they quote, according to the complaint, imported the discriminatory caste systems practices into their team and into Cisco's workplace. That's the same sort of scenario you heard from Prem about, that in some respects, caste systems can be imported into even a society that allegedly is not caste-based. The CRD complaint alleged that because of his caste, this employee received the lowest status job assignments within his team. He was isolated from other members. He received less pay, fewer opportunities. He was subjected to a hostile work environment, subjected to retaliation when he complained to a supervisor and to HR, including he was denied raises and promotions. And then the complaint also alleges that Cisco failed to take reasonable steps to prevent and correct the violations, and instead maintained that discrimination and harassment because of caste were not illegal. That's the position Cisco took.
Okay, so Cisco comes back and says, well, it's not a protected category. So I see. So let me now, David, I'm going to come to you, because with that stage set, like Patrick said, SB 403 was being introduced in parallel as this was unfolding with the Cisco case. You were involved in the early days of explaining to legislative council, the need for a bill like SB 403 and why liberal construction wasn't enough. Can you talk a little bit about why we needed the specific provisions that were in SB 403?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everybody on the panel. Everybody's remarks have been wonderful. There is a really important need for clarity in the law. Clarity in statutes in particular provides signals to employers. It provides signal to people who are in the protected class that the discrimination that's occurring is illegal. So in this case, caste discrimination, we have the example of Cisco, which says in defense of the lawsuit, caste discrimination is not illegal. Look at the statute; it's not there. I personally believe there are very strong legal arguments, not only that California law prohibits caste discrimination, but I think there are strong arguments that federal law does as well. But until it is in ink in the statute, you're always going to have defendants who argue it doesn't apply to me. And I would say that even if you're relying on judicial precedent, we all know that judicial precedent can change over time, right? And we can think, anyone can just look at the Supreme Court's opinions over the past several years and identify precedent that we thought was etched in stone that is no longer etched in stone or has been chiseled out of stone, right? So having it in ink in the statute provides extra protection that judicial interpretation won't change, that defendants won't try to wiggle their ways, or employers won't try to wiggle their way out because it's not explicitly stated in the statute. It also provides assurance to those in the protected class, to caste oppressed people, that the law does protect them. I think a lot of people won't believe it won't believe that they can get justice through the courts unless it's super clear that they are protected. And the law provides that. Having explicit protection in the law provides that level of clarity and assurance. It's also an important acknowledgement, right? Our statutes, particularly our anti-discrimination statutes, are memorializations of the forms of bias that, as a society, we find repugnant. And I think there is tremendous value in explicitly recognizing various groups of people who are facing truly repugnant forms of discrimination, and clearly prohibiting those forms of discrimination memorialized in code. So there just really are tremendous benefits to putting it in the statute that you cannot get with judicial precedent alone.
Well, so let me ask you about that, because the protections that you're talking about memorializing, there were some fringe parties who thought SB 403 did anything but protect them, right? And there were arguments you had to contend with. Can you just talk a little bit about like some of the myths that you had to bust along the way?
Sure. I mean, one of the myths, I think Sapna did a good job busting it already, right? One of the myths was that this statute actually was not facially neutral, was targeted the South Asian community, and therefore the statute itself was discriminatory. This really turns the whole logic and purpose of the amendment on its head, right? This is not the purpose of the statute, right? The purpose of the statute is to prevent discrimination. And if you just spend a second thinking about the argument against, you realize, as Sapna so eloquently described it already, that it really crumbles under scrutiny. And for the reason that is true for the reasons Sapna mentioned, but also for other reasons. The bill itself, the text of the bill itself prohibits caste discrimination. Caste discrimination was ultimately defined to encompass forms of discrimination that exist in various continents, in various communities. It was not a targeted bill in any sense. It was endorsing a broad concept of caste, which would have provided various forms of protection to people in various communities. And so there wasn't even a really strong textual basis ultimately for the argument that this was targeting the South Asian community. The other point to note is anybody can discriminate. Anybody from any background can discriminate against someone based upon their caste, right? It doesn't have to be a South Asian person. In fact, it sort of demonstrates the bias, right? It doesn't have to be a South Asian person discriminating against another South Asian person. It can be like a white American person discriminating against someone based upon their caste, discriminating against an adult, for instance, right? So for all of those reasons, this is not a really well-supported argument, but it was one that we had to contend with.
Thank you for walking through that. I think if I recall correctly, there was this feeling as well of like, oh, well, now am I going to have to declare my caste? I think that was a legitimate fear that people had because they didn't understand kind of enough of how protection works with our laws. Can you speak to that as well, why that was a kind of a flawed assumption?
That's just not a requirement in the anti-discrimination statutes. No one is required to declare their sexual orientation. No one is required to declare that they have a disability. No one is required to declare with disability. If you want a reasonable accommodation, there's some nuances there, but no one is required to declare that they are in a protected status. And it's important to know that the anti-discrimination law prohibits discrimination both based upon someone's actual status, but also on perceived status. So it doesn't even matter whether you declare yourself to be of a particular caste. If someone perceives you that way, that is also an illicit form of discrimination. So there's simply no requirement in the law that anyone would have to declare that they are a particular caste, just like there's no requirement you have to declare your sexual orientation.
Perfect. Super helpful. I think, now that you've laid that foundation, I want to come back to you, Patrick, because the Cisco case is still going, as you said. All of this was going on with the bill. The claims against the two individuals, I think you said, were dismissed, but the suit kept going against Cisco. Can you confirm I've got that right? And also, if so, like, what would that mean?
Well, the case is still going on against Cisco. Those two managers ultimately filed a motion for sanctions against the Civil Rights Department, claiming that it had no legitimate factual or legal basis for the claims against those two individuals. Cisco did not join in that motion. So that was filed in January of 23. In March of 23, the managers withdrew their motion. In April of 23, the Civil Rights Department voluntarily dismissed the claims against them. The court docket doesn't tell us why all that happened, but I could speculate, and I will, that what was going on was the managers filed that motion for sanctions. The CRD didn't really want to deal with it, and it was tangential to what they were trying to accomplish against Cisco. They probably determined that there was no real benefit to them in maintaining that, and so they agreed to dismiss the claims, which took those issues out of the case. But Cisco is still in the case, and it still remains alive against Cisco. And in fact, just recently, in January of this year, the trial court, after the case had gone up and down on some other issues, finally held that the Fair Employment and Housing Act does cover caste discrimination. The caste is included in those other categories. So that's a victory at this point, although the issue is still there. And as David mentioned, a precedent may not last, and this is only a decision by one trial court in California. It could go up on appeal, and in fact, after that decision, Cisco still filed a new answer to an amended complaint, again claiming that the claims based on caste were, quote, non-existent because, quote, California does not recognize caste as a protected category. So they're probably just maintaining that issue for appeal. It's not going to help them anymore, I don't think, in the trial court, but it's still there.
And while, that suit's going on, I think there was another party, one of the organizations, I think it's not Kona, it's HAF, the Hindu American Foundation. Did they file some kind of motion as well? Can you speak about that?
Sure. HAF actually did two things. They, one, filed a motion to intervene in the case in the state court. That's still pending. And that was back in January of 21. They filed that motion, and they made arguments similar to what Sapna was talking about how it singled out Hindus and was discriminatory against Hindus. Ultimately, the trial court in California ruled against that motion and did not allow them to intervene, although it gave them a chance to make that argument again. And so that's still going on, where they're trying to come back and say they still should be allowed to intervene, even though the trial court said they didn't have the kind of interest in the case that justified intervention. At the same time, HAF filed a different lawsuit in federal court, making basically the same arguments. And the federal court finally recently also dismissed that suit on a number of grounds, but gave them leave to amend, so that they might try to come back and do that as well. In fact, they have filed an amended complaint, and now that's still pending in the federal court in the Eastern District of California.
I see. Okay. Well, before we can get to the last question and then move to audience questions, I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that I share the CLE credits for those who are obtaining credit for this. If you're in California, the credit code is CELTF, which is acronym for Caste Equity Legal Task Force, blue, just the color blue. So CELTF blue. And if you're in New York, it is CELTF red. Those were not chosen based on any political affiliation. I realized just now I just chose two colors. So don't read anything into that. So California CELTF blue, New York CELTF red. Okay, so Patrick and David, as practicing attorneys that represent clients, you see this announcement by Governor Newsom, and it's pretty glib, right? It just says Caste is already protected. So now you're kind of left with the next step. So if you've got a client that comes into your office and says, I want to file a suit against my employer or my landlord for caste discrimination, when you look at the governor's actions, the legislation's actions, the current state of the Cisco case, fully aware that, certain things may not be in the media, but you're looking at court documents, you understand what's happening. What do you say to them? How do you talk to them about kind of the realities on the ground, whether or not this is a journey to take, what you're hopeful for, what you're not hopeful for? I'd love your thoughts. Patrick, maybe I'll start with you first because we were just chatting.
Well, I think I would say that the law is still somewhat unsettled as to whether caste is covered or not. There's a risk we could lose if you brought that kind of claim. But that we now have stronger legal arguments under the California Fair Employment and Housing Act than we did a few months ago, especially because of the governor's statement on SB 403 and the trial court's recent decision in the Cisco case. I would also advise this client to file with the California CRD and not the federal EEOC, because Title VII does not have an ancestry category even. And because the EEOC has never determined that caste is covered by any of the categories that they do enforce. CRD, by contrast, has officially taken the position in the Cisco case that caste discrimination is prohibited. So the chances are much better with proceeding in the state system than the federal, I would say.
Maybe David, I'll come to you
Yeah.
then. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree largely with what Patrick has said. I think the correct interpretation of the law is that caste is protected. It does not mean that a court will always adopt what I believe is the correct interpretation of the law. And that is something that one would have to think about and contemplate if they were planning to file a lawsuit based upon caste discrimination. I would also say that it's hard, right? Filing a lawsuit is hard. Standing up against powerful interests is hard. Taking on your employer is hard. And there are civil rights lawyers out there who are ready to support you, and fight for you. But nobody can ever guarantee success. And it would be wonderful if we had nice, clear language in a statute, or a nice, clear language in many statutes to assist you. Right now, we don't. It doesn't mean that it's a hopeless legal fight, but it does mean that there are, potential challenges that have to be contended with. But it certainly is a worthwhile fight, even if, very challenging.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I'm going to use kind of these last 15, 20 minutes to go to the questions that have come in here, and I'll pose them to folks. I think, Sapna, maybe I'll start with you on this question. It's just a curious question about language. I think sometimes we use dominant and marginalized when it comes to caste. Sometimes we use upper and lower, which I know I still do as like a vestige of just how I've heard it over time. Can you talk a little bit about whether that's important, whether it has specific meanings, what the appropriate thing is to do as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And I mean, from the perspective of the way that it appears in text, um, if you're, I think actually I also fall into the upper lower thing because in, colloquial speak, that's usually how we talk about it. That's often how we refer to it as upper and lower. However, that is kind of buying into the Manusmriti classification of certain castes being the ones that are on the top and others that are being on the bottom. I still think that's not altogether untrue because of the privileges. Like they're the ones on the top have more privileges, and so there is a reason to say upper. But I do think that, I mean, again, this is not from a necessarily a theological standpoint, but that potentially to say dominant and marginalized might make more sense from the perspective of talking about the privileges that are afforded, the opportunities that are being afforded to certain caste members versus others, right? And I know this is not a question that came up, but I wanted to go back to that last piece around why is it important to state it, even if caste is already covered in the law, is, and I'll say this as somebody who's also identify as gay, identify as queer, is that you could suggest that one should just not be discriminating. But when the law passed, like let's say, for example, the marriage equality law passed, any number of LGBT protections, but let's just take marriage equality, for example, that the impact on society is so huge to have that said in law. My family was already accepting and loving and all of that of myself and my partner, but having that be codified in law that my wife and I were afforded certain rights and privileges, that made such strides in society, and it has allowed, we've seen in our lifetime since that's happened, and the anniversary of that marriage equality law just passed a couple of days ago in DC. We've seen that in our communities, in our respective, she's Muslim, I'm Hindu, in our respective South Asian communities, we have seen the way that people respond to things being explicit in law, and suddenly we are afforded more visibility as a result, right? So that's also why I think if you're going to make a comparison here, that protected groups, non-dominant or marginalized groups need that explicit in law, in writing, in ink kind of protection. Even if you think it's already there, fine, say it again then. What's the harm in saying it again?
100%, 100%. I'm going to combine two questions, and Prem and Patrick, I'm going to come to you for different perspectives. It's really around, what do we do after Governor Newsom's decision? Do we ask again in the next session? Do we, people were surprised, no veto, but I think like the hardship of a veto and like the incredible politics on the ground is very tough, things like that. And also, quite frankly, laws, they take years to pass. I think the Family Medical Leave Act, I think took 12 years or something, but can you imagine life without it now? So what are the things that you would say, maybe Prem from an advocacy standpoint and Patrick from an impact litigation standpoint, perhaps, or any other standpoint, you would say to keep doing, or that we could take up to eventually see caste as a protected category in the law? Prem, I'll come to you first.
So definitely, like, this veto was unfortunate. So this was the historical opportunity for even for governor, to protect all the caste oppressed communities, as well as all the South Asian community, I would like to say. So that historical bill was to protect everybody, right? So we had huge conversations on that. So after the veto, we have we have gained something in the sense that our community was scattered before. So after SB 403 campaign, even I did not know caste discrimination is rampant in Ravidas community. I did not know that. But we are together. We work together from different age group, right? children to senior citizens, they were there. So we campaigned from like San Diego to Sacramento, right? So we did multiple visits to different policy makers office. This is the historical achievement. I think so, because we did not do that before. We learned how to advocate for ourselves, for our community. That is the achievement. That is the big achievement. And after the veto, definitely that is embarrassing. That is unfortunate for all of us. But now our community is united. Now we are vocal. We know how to advocate for our for our people. So definitely we are not scared of this veto. We are not we are not going to stop this. We will continue. Our strategy will be different, right? So yeah, definitely this has demotivated our people. Some people they had hope. They had hope oh, now our state, California state, will recognize our pain, right? We will have law. We can report this incident. But the opposition, like Hindu American Foundation and some other oppositions, they celebrated the veto, right? They just that is the continuation of that, what they have been doing. So that is a little bit our people, they have uh, like uh, uh, less hope, but we need to work on to empower our people. So we need to bring more and more incidences that is happening in California, in the US. We need to we need to support them with the resources. We need to create more and more resources and continuing these kinds of conversations. How to support legally with the resources, right? So I think, and definitely we need to advocate from city level to state level, and we need to keep educating our people.
Thank you, Prem. I think I just want to reflect on even the gamut of emotion that you just spanned in 2 minutes of feeling dejection, feeling hope, then feeling defeated, and then saying, no, we're going to fight again. That is a very emblematic reaction to advocacy, right? Some days you're on top of the world and some days you're like, we are nowhere. And that is a sign that you just keep fighting, because you really have to keep chipping away at it with education, with sharing experiences. Like you said, how many people connected after this? And suddenly you just realize you're much stronger together. And now there's talk of city bills in multiple states, state bills in multiple areas. And I think aside from, California, Revive in New Jersey and Oregon and a couple of other places. So we continue building that wave. Patrick, I'm sorry that we kind of crossed Zoom wires there. Do you want to share what your thoughts were?
Well, I actually don't know where I stand on trying to introduce something like SB 403 again in California at this point. I think I defer to you, Tanuja, and to David, and to others who are more involved in the actual work towards getting that through before, as to whether it makes sense to try to do it again. I would probably advocate more for focusing on litigation now. We do have this one case that says Caste is covered. We have the governor's statement, which may help to say it's already covered. And if we could establish that more firmly in the law by someone taking it up on appeal and getting the appellate courts and ultimately the California Supreme Court to agree on that, then we'd be in a pretty good position going forward. And then you could think about whether you really need to add caste as an explicit category or not, or is it more like sexual orientation in the federal law, which doesn't say sexual orientation, but the Supreme Court has now interpreted it to include sexual orientation within sex. So I guess I would want to see if we could generate more litigation, have people willing to step forward and go through that kind of litigation, which I think David was talking about how difficult it is. But some people have to be willing to do it, and to see if it can be established more firmly that caste is already covered. And if that's lost, then you have to go back to the legislature.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very easy to say, yep, it's covered, but then not say how, right? And so the litigation would help us get to how. We've got another question from a person who's actually in the UK and says the legal situation in the US has ended up virtually identical to where we got into the UK in 2013. So this is over a decade ago, right? And the opposition is identical to what this person experienced in the UK. The question is, how can we combine forces to move this forward? And I think, you know, Prem, you've spoken to that a little bit in terms of sharing experiences. I'd be curious from a legal perspective, David and Patrick, if there's any thoughts you have, kind of given that it is completely different bodies of law, where there would be areas for potential collaboration, if at all.
You know, I don't know so much, you know, from an international law legal perspective, because I'm not an international lawyer. I don't practice international law, but I do think historically, if I understand correctly, historically there have been pushes to get the UN to do more to recognize and prohibit caste discrimination. I think it's done some, but there have been efforts to do more. And there may be ways to, you know, think about doing international, you know, either bringing cases under international law or getting policy statements from international legal bodies. But I'm of the opinion that with a movement like Movement for Caste Equity, and any movement where you are fighting against oppression, using the law to fight against oppression, you have to move on all fronts at the same time. So we have to keep litigating, right? And we have to use the courts in the US, we have to use the courts in the UK. We can talk about strategies and arguments, you know, we can connect about strategies and arguments that we're facing, right? In both UK courts and US courts, because the arguments that will get made are probably similar just from a social perspective, maybe not from a legal perspective, but the social perspective necessarily influences how courts view protected categories. Who's in this protected class and who's not is really sometimes is a legal determination that's influenced by social understanding. And I think sharing notes on those types of things can be potentially really useful and valuable. Similarly, on the legislative front, the arguments that we face on the legislative front, some are legal or legalistic, but they're also very clearly influenced by the social factors that surrounded this bill. And similar ones, it sounds like, were affecting the UK's ability to take action on caste equity. So I think in all places, at all times, we need to move on multiple fronts: litigation to get relief in the courts, legislation to make it nice and clear in the statutes, and social mobilization, developing community, like Prem was talking about so eloquently, developing community, developing mobilization for action to stand up against caste oppression. All three things have to have, and then also what we're doing right now, right? Education. What Tanuja, you have done so amazingly, spreading the word through the media, through putting on events like this. You really have to move on all four fronts at the same time: litigation, legislation, community action, and education. And if you know, that's the ticket, right? And doing that locally, as Prem spoke so well about, you do it locally, you do it regionally, you do it nationally, and you do it internationally, and you know, develop the fora for that type of exchange to happen. So I don't know, we have to do you know, everything everywhere all at once, you know, like just do it all. and get 8 hours of sleep, right? Like
That is the perfect rallying cry right there. I love that. I know we are coming up on the end of the panel. I want to thank our panelists so much for your time and your dedication to this fight and providing this education to everyone. For those who tuned in, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to learn about this. I hope you walk away with some new information or a new perspective. Please, we're going to do these throughout the year, so tell your friends, tell your friends' friends, tell your enemies. We want all of them to join and to learn about this and get the word out. For those who are receiving credits for continuing legal education, we will follow up with the certificates. And thank you again. The fight continues. Take care.